Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On this episode, we're taking a long probing look at the Armenia-Azerbaijan negotiation process. It's that ongoing saga of hope, disappointment, and vaguely worded bilateral statements that makes the phrase, "we're making progress," sound both promising and grim at the same time. Ever since 2022, Armenia and Azerbaijan have seemed tantalizingly close to penning a definitive peace agreement. For each passing year, we watch the clock tick towards December 31st with an almost childlike anticipation, only to discover that Santa didn't leave a peace treaty under the tree. And guess what? 2024 is no exception. Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report.
The current dire situation between Azerbaijan and Armenia has been a leading cause of strife in their respective region. Although the cold to sometimes hot conflict between these two countries has been ongoing since the Soviet Union's collapse over 30 years ago, Azerbaijan's rush into the Nagorno-Karabakh region last year pushed tensions over the edge. Armenia, due to Russian inaction on the matter, suspended its activities as part of the Moscow-led CSTO, and its relations with Azerbaijan and its ally Turkey completely collapsed. Various countries and entities like Russia, the European Union, the US and of course Turkey itself have tried to mend the situation.
I'm concentrating on being useful. What do we need to do? We need a Europe that continues to bring President Aliyev to the table. So that's why I'm supporting the mediation in Brussels.
Baku and Yerevan have sat at the negotiating table several times to finally resolve the conflict, and the talks may soon result in a solid peace agreement. Stability in this region and a resolution to the conflict is necessary in the eyes of many observers, as they fear that the situation could become yet another theatre in the standoff between the West and Russia.
The signing of a permanent peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia will be a new source of hope for peace, tranquility and stability in our region and the world.
It is therefore up to Armenia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and a normalization of relations between them to not let this happen.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. A joint declaration in December 2023 had Armenia giving a big thumbs up to Azerbaijan, hosting COP29 in November 2024, while Azerbaijan reciprocated by releasing 32 Armenian prisoners of war. It's not your usual Secret Santa, but hey, at least it set a positive tone. Suddenly, all eyes were on COP29 as an informal deadline. Could these two neighbors actually reach a final deal? You know, by the time world leaders gather to talk about saving the planet and indulging in overpriced pastries at the summit buffet? Early on, we were treated to tidbits of what sounded like actual progress. March to May 2024 saw the delimitation of the 12-kilometer border section, the first major step since 1991. Granted, that progress was slightly overshadowed by Baku's not-so-subtle threats of force, but in the realm of Armenia-Azerbaijan relations, hey, we're threatening you a little less can qualify as a forward movement. By October 2024, Armenia's parliament ratified a regulatory framework for the Delimitation Commission, and Azerbaijan's president gave his nod too. Then Germany and the United States swooped in, trying to play matchmaker. We had the German Chancellor hosting leaders at the Munich Security Conference, foreign ministers meeting in Berlin, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken holding two sets of meetings with Pashinyan and Aliyev in July and September over in Washington. It was a big year for frequent flyer miles. Even Michael Carpenter, special assistant to the US president, visited both Armenia and Azerbaijan in October 2024. I can just imagine him casually handing over a letter from President Biden that basically said, "Sign something by the end of 2024, please, and thank you," stamped with a discreet but urgent sense of American persuasion. We'd really like you to sign, like now. Then came the big one, the Kazan-Russia meeting in October 2024 during the BRICS summit. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan described the bilateral talks as quite positive, like an above-average pizza place. The negotiations? Pretty good, 4 stars. The crust was a little crispy, but we'll be back. Armenian and Azerbaijani officials kept dropping optimistic hints, noting that much of the text has been agreed. They tease us more than a Netflix trailer for the next big fantasy series. Now, the Armenian government even said that they'd happily sign off on everything they'd agreed to so far, and hammer out the last sticky bits later. And that's where things got interesting. Azerbaijan still refused to sign unless specific preconditions were met, and that came down to two major sticking points. First, the mention of Karabakh in Armenia's constitution. And second, the question of whether third country forces might suddenly pitch a tent along the Armenia-Azerbaijan border. Essentially, Azerbaijan was like, look, we'd absolutely love to sign, but only if we tweak your constitution, drop your legal claims, and oh yeah, ban any troops we don't like. COP29, as we all know, came and went with no grand unveiling of a peace deal. Armenia didn't even send a delegation, reportedly because Azerbaijan refused to release any additional Armenian prisoners of war. Hard to swap business card at a climate conference when you're home, wondering if your captured soldiers will ever see the light of day. Prime Minister Pashinyan insisted that 90% of the treaty text was set, and so maybe they just needed a little more time. So as we count down to 2025, let's remember that forging peace takes more than good intentions and polite declarations. Now, it's up to them to ensure that 2025 isn't just another year of headlines reading, wait, they still haven't signed? And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Rafi Elliott, a political risk analyst, Armenian Mirror Spectator. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thanks so much for having me back on the show.
So today we are once again examining the Azerbaijan and Armenian situation. Can you give us the most recent update? And when it comes to, well, the whole negotiation situation, have we seen anything new?
So yeah, just the short recap was following the ceasefire on November 9th of 2020, which ended the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. There was this new impetus to find a final peaceful solution to the conflict and normalize relations between the two states, which have been in a state of de facto conflict since 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. But however, the big news today is that there's no news, essentially speaking, that we are either very close to signing a peace agreement or very far away from it, depending on who you ask. But the big difference is that the Azerbaijani president very recently, in a news conference he held with the Russian press, officially stated what his demands were for a peace agreement, and the Armenian prime minister also made responses to those, which are worth unpacking.
Right. So do you think these demands, either be it from the Azerbaijani side or the Armenian side, is something feasible? Or in, well, clearer terms, do you think that this is an actual attempt at coming to a peace negotiation, or they're pretty much just still trying to gather their bargaining chips?
No, I mean, literally of the six officially stated new demands, if you will, none of them are in any way practical or feasible. Most of them seem designed to be humiliating for Armenia, which basically makes them impossible to pass to begin with. So when I say there's 2 points of view on this matter, the one point of view is that the Azerbaijanis are trying to push a sort of their side treaty onto Armenia and try to gain as much as they can out of a peace process while they still can. The other way to look at it is that the Azerbaijanis are not at all actually interested in peace and are deliberately putting out, conditions for peace that are not meant to be met. Therefore, they can continuously drag out the process and maintain this sense of no peace, no war, which has benefited the Azerbaijani leadership, as well as past Armenian leaderships, to be honest, because it always adds the specter of a revanchist enemy and a conflict that remains unresolved, therefore allowing for the need for strong measures by a increasingly autocratic government, at least in Azerbaijan's case.
Right. So how are any third country, third party mediators looking at the situation? If, like you mentioned, these terms are pretty much a demonstration not of goodwill, but of, in stronger words, humiliation. Don't you think that some of these mediators will not look fondly on it?
So I'll break that down into 2 parts. First, I think it's worth listing what the latest and the most clear demands have been from the Azerbaijani president. Out of the 6, the first one is that Armenia needs to amend its constitution to remove any claims on Azerbaijani territory. The second one is that they need to remove all international third-party forces from Armenian territory. The other one is for Armenia to stop its military reforms and purchasing weapons from France and India, which we've discussed previously on this show. They also want Armenia to drop all proceedings against Azerbaijan in the International Criminal Court. And another one is to ensure the right of return of all Azerbaijanis living in the territory of Armenia during Soviet times. And finally is to disband the OSCE Minsk Group. So to answer the second part of your question, the OSCE Minsk Group was the international format that had been developed in 1993, 1994 in order to find a practical and peaceful resolution to the conflict. So Azerbaijan literally wants to remove any figment of a remaining third-party negotiators in the conflict resolution. And at this point, there currently are no third-party negotiators, although Russia has, right after the 2020 ceasefire, been involved as part of, in fact, it's one of the signatories to the tripartite agreement, the ceasefire agreement, whereas the United States has also kind of entered and pressured both sides to try to find an agreement. But there is currently no official mediating partner at all.
Right, and the whole demands, like you mentioned, seems really paradoxical, even though it's being called a peace negotiation, ceasefire, or any sort of whatever name they want to give it. It does seem like there is no goodwill to actually achieve any sort of semblance of peace. So do you think that the current situation is beneficial for Azerbaijan to kind of keep this tension going, seeing that they probably do not want anything fruitful to come out of the ceasefire?
So it might be, but it's very risky for the Azerbaijani authorities. Both sides are essentially preparing for an upcoming Trump administration. And Trump, by the way, was president of the United States during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. And although he tried to negotiate one of the ceasefire agreements, it fell apart within about 18 hours, and then he made no effort since then. The general wisdom on the matter is that Trump himself has ties to wealthy businessmen in Turkey and Azerbaijan. Therefore, some people might assume that he would be more inclined to empathize with authoritarian regimes like Azerbaijan. However, he also has built his presidential campaign in 2024 around, protecting the Christian Western civilized world, and Armenia being the first and oldest Christian nation. There is an argument to be played there. So he remains a very unpredictable character, and both sides are kind of preparing for this. And so for Azerbaijan, it could go well. It could go very badly as well. In fact, the reason why one of their conditions for the peace agreement is for Armenia to stop arming itself is because they are concerned that the capability gap between the Azerbaijani and Armenian militaries is shrinking very quickly. Armenia has learned lessons. In fact, as often is the case when the loser of a certain conflict will learn lessons, and the winner often learns the wrong lessons. So from Armenia's point of view, all that Armenia really needs to do militarily is be difficult enough to invade that it's no longer worth it for Azerbaijan. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan is trying to extract as many concessions from Armenia, either through the threat of war or through actual direct military actions. So that corridor of time is shrinking very rapidly for Azerbaijan. After that, it's very unclear how they will act. Azerbaijan also has been overplaying its hand when it comes to the international community. It had hosted the International Environmental Meeting, the UN-mediated conference, which ended up being quite a disaster for Azerbaijan and shone a lot of international light on matters of human rights abuses, abuses against journalists and things like that in Azerbaijan, which they probably did not want to highlight. So it's very unclear what the actual tangible gains will be for Azerbaijan, but they're still playing their hand to see how far they can get. They have no reason to insist on peace with Armenia in a peace agreement that would be beneficial for both sides. They're looking for a triumphalist peace. They want to be able to say that, well, we allowed Armenia to exist, therefore we're magnanimous. which of course is ridiculous and will not really work in Armenia. I mean, implying to Armenia has to change parts of its constitution, which incidentally, the Armenian prime minister responded to that claim by actually invoking or passing the issue to the Constitutional Court of Armenia, which ruled correctly, in fact, that the Armenian constitution makes absolutely no references to the territory of any other country outside of Armenia's sovereign borders. So the claim is kind of ridiculous. And at least from Armenia's point of view, if Azerbaijan says that there is an implication that there are territorial claims, now the Armenian Constitutional Court has made an official ruling saying that we do not interpret the Armenian constitution as implying this. So if Azerbaijan were really interested, if that were really the concern for Azerbaijan, that Armenian revanchists would use legalese language to start a conflict 10 years down the road, I mean, Armenia's constitutional court says that is not possible. So Azerbaijan should drop this immediately, but they haven't, which tells you what the real intentions are.
Right. Last but not least, I'm also wondering what will the lack of a ceasefire mean for Pashinyan, especially with this position, political position within the country?
Correct. So Armenia is actually coming up on an election year in about a year. 2026 is when the next parliamentary election is expected. Armenia, actually, the Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, called for a pre-term election several months after the ceasefire. Actually won a resounding victory, although since then his approval ratings have dropped considerably. However, as we discussed last time, there still seems to be no real alternative to him. He remains by default the most popular politician in Armenia. And I think if I could gauge Armenian public opinion, I would say a lot of people are unhappy with or uneased by the situation, but there is a quiet understanding that we are treading through dangerous waters and there are no better ideas right now in terms of the diplomatic process. Armenia has been essentially doing all the right things. The Armenian economy is the fastest growing in the region. The Armenian average person is the wealthiest now in the region, and that includes outlying countries like Turkey and Iran. Probably even Russia, if you factor out the Ukraine war imbalance on the economy. So Armenia is doing quite well. It has really diversified its diplomacy with stronger ties with India, with France, with the United States, and so on and so forth. So it was a gamble, but it seems to be a pretty interesting one that may pay off for Armenia. So it could work out for Nikol Pashinyan. Otherwise, there are no other alternatives. One point to add, though, is despite this rhetoric and despite the, as I said earlier, it might be signed tomorrow, it might never be signed point of view, Aliyev actually confirmed that of the 17 articles that are actually on the negotiation list, both sides have already agreed to 15 of them. So on paper, they actually are quite close to a peace agreement. In principle and in practice, it's never clear what actually happens, of course.
All right, so we'll have to keep an eye out for further developments. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Trade between Kazakhstan and the United States reached $3.3 billion between January and September 2024. This is a record high figure in the last 4 years and a sign of Kazakhstan diversifying its partners.
The news about record trade was broken at a special meeting of heads of US companies and the US-Kazakhstan Business Council. The summit was reportedly focused on strengthening investment ties between the two countries in the areas of logistics, agriculture, infrastructure, IT and energy. The Kazakh side presented new investment opportunities, such as tax incentives and the digitization of Kazakhstan's tax administration to help improve the transparency of various mechanisms. The US side said it would like to send another business delegation to Kazakhstan as soon as possible. They also emphasized the need for the US business community to establish permanent and normal trade relations with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's role as a stabilizing force in its region was also highlighted at the meeting.
A report by the Center for Public Administration at the University of Ulster shows improper and systematic redistribution of land in Uzbekistan that benefits property developers. This redistribution apparently takes place at the expense of individual citizens.
The report, titled A False Sense of Legality, examines property seizures in Uzbekistan over an 8-year period between 2017 and 2024. This land redistribution reportedly involves frequent serious abuses of power, which are potential violations of the country's criminal code and even its constitution. Although the situation has been brought before the President's office and other national accountability bodies, no meaningful action has been taken to address it, according to the report. The issue focuses on the problem of private land being effectively expropriated not for public benefit, but for the personal gains of officials or their colleagues and relatives. It is also apparently very difficult for citizens to oppose forced displacement because courts prove unwilling to annul these illegal decrees.
Kazakhstan is grappling with a very serious spread of desertification. More than 3/4 of the country's agricultural land has become susceptible to degradation.
The UN Convention to Combat Desertification's lead scientist, Baron Joseph Orr, warned the leaders and officials gathered at the COP29 conference that warming caused loss of agricultural land can lead to the loss of biodiversity. This in turn will reduce living standards and lead to migration from rural communities to urban ones. The ability to reverse the damage caused by land degradation, according to Orr, is non-existent after a certain threshold. Kazakhstan, which is a prominent participant in the convention, is a country which is highly at risk from desertification. 2/3 of its land is considered pasture land, and more than 75% of it is subject to degradation. Desertification is also currently a serious problem for 7 out of the country's 17 regions. In these, rising temperatures and reduced rainfall are the main causes behind the situation.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.